A few videos back, I stated what I expected of the European Union as part of a series of videos of what I expected from the various actors involved in Brexit. Due to the initial last-minute extension plus the subsequent one to Halloween, events rather overtook me. But in this shameful lull in the proceedings, I thought it worth revisiting my thoughts as a way of restating the expectations I had before this latest betrayal, whilst our hard-working MPs are enjoying another well-earned break. In a straightforward manner, the EU could be viewed as the opponent here in the negotiations between the EU and those who voted for Brexit. However, for anybody who has been giving this whole catastrophe even the most cursory of glances, it will be obvious that the EU is only one of the many opponents that Brexiteers face, and out of all of them, the EU is probably the most honest and open of them all. Considering the less than sparkling view I have of the EU as a whole, that speaks volumes for the venal, cowardly, backstabbing, mendacious, unprincipled, undemocratic and downright treacherous behaviour of the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Sky News, pretty much all of the print media, business leaders, the judiciary, Parliament, and most disgraceful of all, our own elected government. So whilst appreciating the supreme irony of wanting to leave the undemocratic institution of the EU, we have discovered that our own British government has displayed an abandonment of democracy far in advance of that of the EU. I thought I would state what I would expect of an honourable British government if in fact such a thing actually existed. And due to the utterly appalling behaviour of the British government, this list is somewhat longer. I expect the British government, having held a plebiscite to settle a matter that could not be settled without the involvement of the British electorate, to honour the decision that was taken in good faith by those in whom sovereignty ultimately lies, the British people. I expect the British government, as the government of the United Kingdom, to defend the United Kingdom. I expect the British government to protect the interests of the UK over and above the interests of the EU. I expect the British government to protect the interests of British nationals in the EU. I expect also the British government to give due regard to the interests of EU citizens living in the UK. I expect the British government to seek solutions from Brexit that will benefit the citizens of the UK and, where possible, also the interests of citizens of the EU. Where that is not possible, I expect the British government to favour the interests of its own citizens. I expect the British government to be responsible in its dealings with what will remain, despite everything, a close trading partner, and more crucially, a very important ally. I expect the British government, whilst acknowledging the importance of the institution of the EU, to highlight that Britain's commitment to that other and perhaps more important supranational body, NATO, remains undiminished. Furthermore, I would expect the British government to reassure, repeatedly if necessary, and by deed as well as word, that withdrawal from the EU has no bearing whatsoever on Britain's commitment as a NATO member to fulfil its primary pledge, namely that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all. I expect the British government, whilst acknowledging the outcome of the referendum, to do everything within its power to maintain the cohesiveness of the United Kingdom, with particular reference to the fact that Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain within the EU. I expect the government of the United Kingdom to be a government of the United Kingdom, and not just of England. I expect the British government to negotiate with its familial neighbour, the Republic of Ireland, as a close and equal partner, and to acknowledge that our shared histories, although not without difficulties, as being deeper, longer, and somewhat more important than those we have with the EU. Furthermore, I expect the British government, along with Parliament, to acknowledge the gravity of the responsibility with which they have been entrusted, and to use every single one of the extra days that they have granted themselves in this extension to the 31st of October to deliver on their promises to those to which they are accountable. But as with the EU, there are things that I do not expect from the British government. I do not expect the British government, along with Parliament in particular, to place themselves as an entity above that of the British people. The British government are employed by the British people. Their wages, as well as any other privileges or benefits enjoyed, are paid for by the British taxpayer. The British government are nothing more than managers, and their task is to do the British people's bidding, whatever that may be. During normal business, the British people bequeath the British government, under licence and for a limited time period, certain liberties to make decisions on their behalf. In this instance of the referendum, which is by definition not normal business, the British government has been given a specific instruction, and as such, its duty is merely to execute that instruction, whatever the personal beliefs of the individual members of that government. I do not expect the British government to second guess, interpret or evaluate the specific instruction of the referendum. That is not its task. Its task is to implement it. I do not expect the British government, either by neglect or by deliberate intent, to attempt to frustrate, thwart or undermine the decision taken in the referendum. I do not expect the British government to shame or embarrass the British population by requesting special privileges from the EU in the course of the negotiations. To put it more bluntly, I do not expect the British government to grovel to the EU to remain in the single market, the customs union or any other institution of the EU where access is defined by membership. I do not expect the British government to attempt to use EU nationals living in the UK as any kind of bargaining chip in the negotiations. Many hundreds of thousands, even millions of EU nationals have lived, worked, paid tax, put down roots and raised families in the UK, and their personal lives should not be subject to political forces beyond their control. I do not expect the British government to engage in any divide and conquer tactics with reference to individual nations within the EU. I do not likewise expect the British government to allow the EU to engage in any similar tactics with regard to the individual home nations of the UK. I do not expect the British government to conduct itself as if it were merely the English government. All the home nations of the UK are what made Britain great, and they are to be respected as such, whichever way their populations voted. And finally, I do not expect the British government, along with Parliament, to treat these negotiations as just another day at the office, specifically with regard to parliamentary recess. Like school children, Parliament has just returned from their Easter recess of 12 days, 6 of which could feasibly be described as holidays. However, for all self-employed people, not to mention the great bulk of employed people, for whom the guarantee of time off at Easter is but a dim memory, this lack of commitment to the national common good is hardly overwhelming. Looking forward from the 1st of May, and judging from the previous year, out of the 132 working days left, Parliament is planning on not sitting on 52 of them. That's over 10 weeks. The Speaker of the House, John Bercow, revelling in his unexpected celebrity, attempted to soothe the wounded pride of MPs by reassuring them that none of you are traitors. There are many who would argue that point, but however you look at it, and compared with the work ethic of the majority of Brits, they can hardly be described as hard working. To add insult to injury, as if we haven't had enough of either so far, it appears that traditionally not a great deal of parliamentary work is actually done on a Friday or a Monday. Add that into the mix and MPs are likely to have about 4 months off between now and Halloween. Traitors? Probably. Idle shirkers? Unarguably. So as you will no doubt have noticed, the British government, including Parliament, has fallen short of many of the standards that I, as a citizen, might have expected. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. But I am beginning to wonder whether our much vaunted mother of all parliaments, freed from the shackles of Brussels, is really the kind of democracy that we're going to need post-Brexit. My suspicion is that the battle for British democracy has only just begun. Brexit is perhaps only the first step. Nevertheless, I say, bring it on.